everyone. Good afternoon. Hope we've had a good time so far. We're about to begin the Clean Energy and Energy Transition in Africa panel. So I'll be the moderator for this panel. I'm Ruth Ochoma. I'm an MSFS candidate, so I'm in the School of Foreign Service, a second-year graduate student focusing on science, tech, and international affairs, and clean and energy, climate, and the global environment. So today we have three speakers, virtual and 3 in person. So I'll just let the in-person speakers introduce themselves. So Andrew, thank you.
Hi, everyone. First, thanks to Georgetown, and thank you for organizing this event. I'm a Georgetown graduate. That's the most important thing. I graduated from the School of Foreign Service, and I went to the Law Center as well, so it's always great to be back here at Georgetown. This building didn't exist when I was here, but it was built by one of my classmates' families, so yeah. I wasn't as successful as he was, I guess. Currently I'm the Chief Development Officer at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, which is the U.S. government's development bank. Many of you might have been familiar with OPIC, its predecessor, which was the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. And prior to this position, from 2013 to 2020, I launched and ran an initiative called Power Africa that President Obama launched, and we turned it into the largest public-private partnership for development in the world, with the goal of trying to double access to electricity in sub-Saharan Africa, and helped about 150 million people get access to electricity for the first time, but we still have a very long way to go. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Morgan.
So hi, everybody. My name is Morgan Landy. I'm the Global Director for Infrastructure at the International Finance Corporation, or IFC, which is the private sector part of the World Bank. So I'm based here in DC. I worked on Wall Street coming out of college. I joined IFC many years ago, mostly focusing on infrastructure, energy, transport, utilities, global portfolio. Most of my time I've spent here in DC, but I had 2 overseas assignments, first in Vietnam. I lived there about 3 or 4 years, and then in Istanbul, Turkey, always focusing on energy, infrastructure kind of issues. And now I run the team based in DC. So nice to see you. Look forward to the conversation, and thanks to Ruth and the organizers for inviting us.
Thank you. Nekabari.
Sure. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nekabari Goka. I serve as a principal on the corporate strategy team at Exelon Utilities. Not to be confused with Exxon, but Exelon Utilities, which is the parent company of Pepco, for those of you that live in DC. So thank you for paying your bills on time. And so I am an energy and more specifically electricity market economist. And in that vein, I spent most of my work and study focusing on the many issues that contribute to the generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity as a physical commodity, but then also looking at factors that influence the formation of markets for electricity commodity-based financial derivatives. And so I've done work in electricity market constructs all over the world, and I think most relevant and most important to this conversation is I've done so in Africa as well. Andy maybe doesn't know this, but most of my work has actually been done with the Power Africa initiative, studying issues related to cross-border power trading in East Africa. So I spent some time in Tanzania, sort of studying some of those issues. So I think that the energy sort of discussion in Africa is a robust one, and I'm looking forward to today's conversation. And again, thanks to the planning committee here at Georgetown for the opportunity.
Okay, so we'll have Dr. Alex Ibrahim.
Hi there, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm executive director at Wando PLC, which is a fully integrated oil and gas company. We started off in the downstream and built a midstream entity and all the way to an upstream entity. We operate out of Nigeria mostly, Sao Tome and Principe, and a few other African spots. But what's exciting for today's panel is that I also transitioned to be the president and CEO of the Wando Clean Energy Company, where we would hopefully get the opportunity to talk about some of the exciting things we're doing on the continent. But most importantly, I'd love to hear from everyone else, on the panel as to their perspective on the Africa challenge, I say. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Kwabena.
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Kwabena Osei Sarpong. I am founder and CEO of Rife International. Rife is a climate tech, energy efficiency and renewable energy services company based in the United States. We got offices in Africa, working in Ghana, South Africa. I currently actually am in Abuja, Nigeria. I spoke at a diaspora conference here regarding the same subject matter. I think Africa has the opportunity to leapfrog and in this renewable energy, clean energy transition. And I think it's a perfect opportunity to discuss what the challenges, opportunities are, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my panelists and engaging everybody else. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. I think there's meant to be one. Okay, anyway, we'll just move on. Thank you everybody for joining us and taking time out. Some of our virtual participants are even in a different time zone, so we really appreciate the support. So just to start, I mean, we know like clean energy, the energy transition is really important. Like today, that's the discussion, climate. The COP27 was held in Egypt, in an African country, just showing how important the African continent is in the energy transition, considering that they're like Africa are like they're the most vulnerable, like a lot of countries there are the most vulnerable in when you think about the impacts of energy on the environment. So, but just to start and set the stage for this discussion, I would like to ask Kwabena given this year's conference theme, the future is African, harnessing opportunities for a prosperous continent. What is your definition of the vision of energy transformation in Africa, and how is the work you're doing advancing that vision?
So you mentioned Kwabena, but you looked at me.
Right. My apologies.
Apologies for the awkward silence there. I was trying to figure out what was going on.
Okay, I mean, yeah, I was
You can learn my name.
My apologies, yes. Nekabari, please. Sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And so, and can you reframe the question again?
Okay, so the question
Full life
is,
cycle here.
Given this year's conference theme, the future is African, harnessing opportunities for a prosperous continent, what is your vision of energy transformation in Africa? And currently, what work are you doing to advance that vision?
Excellent. All right. It's interesting that you use the word transformation. And I will say that in my own circles, we spent a lot of time discussing what the words mean. And so you'd be surprised at how much we spend discussing whether or not transformation or transition is an appropriate word to talk about what needs to happen in Africa. So the thinking, of course, is that transition maybe doesn't sort of support the kind of urgency that we need, and transformation does. But when you talk to people who are in the business of financing very, very expensive energy infrastructure, rapid transformation sometimes is a bit of a challenging thing to sort of take in and understand. But I think in the context of Africa specifically, and it wouldn't be a conference if I didn't roundabout sort of answer the question, but in the context of Africa specifically, I think it's the focus on balancing two different aspects. I think there is the aspect associated with advancing the clean energy transition, the aspect associated with making sure that there are a number of folks across the continent that simply do not have access to energy in the immediate and near terms, but then also balancing that with what that means in the context of economic development, especially in an environment where the world is so focused on climate change. I think we will get into it, later on to sort of talk about sort of the disparities, if you will, between the contribution of Africa to global climate change emissions versus the pressures that are put on African continents or African countries to sort of follow some of that guidance. So I think, if anything, transformation is the word that you used. I think it's important that we think about it in an African context, about the ability to do both things, focus on sort of the immediate needs, but then also sort of balance the aspects associated with economic development as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, you mentioned so many things that we're going to dive into later on in the conversation. Dr. Alex, so I'd like to ask you the same question. What is your vision for energy transformation in Africa, and what are you currently doing to actualize that vision?
I think my co-panelist has done a great job on the context of naming. Transformation, transition, I can tell you, as close as those names sound, they mean completely different things, especially when you get down the value chain to financing a lot of these projects. So I'll step back a little bit. just some context. I mean, I know there was the disparity that was placed in the room, but when we speak about Africa, we're talking about, that single light bulb in the middle of a village square in comparison to, say, developed countries where you have the fourth television and the fifth bedroom in a home, of probably even a middle class income earner. So the level of depravity that exists in Africa sort of views the transition in a way that has to deal first and foremost with the issues around adaptation, right? Okay, I tell you 80% of rural Africa cooks today with charcoal, firewood. Some of you may have never seen that before, but maybe barbecues you might have, and have no electricity. So when you're dealing with a continent where 600 plus million people have no access to electricity, the construct of transformation that cost even more than the energy-based systems that exist today in abundance, at least on the continent. I'm talking fossil fuels and gas and all of that, becomes a non-starter, frankly. Right. So the question is, how do you then mobilize the mind so the body can move? And for us, what we've realized is that the transition has to happen, unfortunately, with the governments leading that charge, which we've seen a lot of African governments have declared at least some sort of net zero promises. Nigeria for sure is 2060. And we then see private sector and the largely, I would say, balance sheet capable companies come in to really advance that space. We're an oil and gas company. I say the people that would advance the research, adaptation, and implementation and scaling of projects across Africa will be the oil and gas companies, because indeed we do have the balance sheets and we can roll out these projects, create scale, and then attract the funding that needs to come to the continent to drive these projects forward. So from our perspective, what we're doing is trying to create these projects, create this portfolio of not just ideas, but bankable projects, and backing them up with our equity to ensure that they actually get done and realized. And off the back of that, we can start to show, first and foremost, that we don't abandon the resources we have completely, but we must produce them in a more carbon-friendly way. I'm talking oil and gas. Gas will be around for quite a while. I believe it will form the largest component of the future value chain of energy. We have abundant gas in Africa, and to imagine powering Africa without that resource that is already in ground and able to move around in a carbon-friendly way, it would be certainly taking Africa back, steps backwards. So that's what we're doing: scaling projects, creating those ideas, and taking them to fruition, so they can then morph into things that are much larger and certainly penetrate deeper into the continent. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask Morgan the same question, considering you work with the IFC and they do a lot of investments in energy. So just to talk a bit about the work you're doing at the IFC in aiding Africa in the energy transition.
Great. So, so IFC, again, the private sector part of the World Bank, we're a development bank, and our job is to work with the private sector to help figure out how to meet these development challenges. And the reality is, the needs in Africa energy far outstrip the ability of any government to do it. So the goal is working with USAID, working with the US government, working with the governments on the ground, the World Bank and Africa Development Bank, to figure out how can we get all hands on deck to really maximize the impact of the scarce resources that are out there. How do we use government money to set the regulatory environment, to have strong utilities, to attract the private sector to come and invest large amounts of money for all kinds of energy, whether it's distribution, transmission, generation, et cetera. I believe that the big imperative for us is that there are 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa without modern electricity at a reliable, provision of reliable electricity at a reasonable price. 600 million people. That's a huge development challenge. That means factories that don't have low-cost, reliable power to produce things. That means families that don't have it. That means the whole economy doesn't have it. So what can we do to step in and lean in? So I think it takes all hands on deck. And one of the good developments recently, in the past 10 years, when we first started investing in solar power and wind power at IFC 10 or 15 years ago, these technologies were more expensive. You had to subsidize them to get them on the ground. Africa has fantastic resources. And half of the power in Africa is generated by hydropower, already renewable. The next big thing is going to be solar and wind, but even more solar. The solar resource in Africa is enormous. The question is, how do you mobilize it? How do you get these bankable projects that my panelist colleague was talking about? How do you attract the finance to it? But my view is that it's not a financial gap. It's an organizational gap and a project development gap. So how do we do things to attract the capital? The capital is there. How do we make a viable, attractive projects so that people want to put their money in these projects? This is where the challenge is. And that's where I think it really is. There's not one answer. It's not gas or hydro or solar or distribution or public or private. It's all of it, all of the above. And the question is, how do we make that happen? I'm actually quite optimistic because there's a huge focus on it. There's huge creativity. And if you think about the costs of delivering this power, if you think about solar power, 10 years ago, it was up here. Today, pushed all the way down. There's a cost curve driving solar power production way down. And if you can figure out a way to make it really attractive, it's the lowest cost source of power generation today in many countries. So at IFC, and I'll stop there, we've been working on what would it take to help African countries and utilities in Africa get the benefit of this low-cost solar power that's happening in China, in the US, in Europe. It takes some regulatory reform to make it attractive. It takes some credit-worthy utilities so that people, when they sign a contract for 10 or 20 years, they're comfortable they're going to get paid. And that's where we think the World Bank Group and other partners can help. Provide the kind of comfort that people that will invest a lot of money will actually get their money back and get returned while they're delivering low-cost power. So today in Senegal, in Zambia, in Cote d'Ivoire, we're seeing power prices lower than anywhere in the world. It can be done. The question is, how do we lean in and do more of it? And that's where the challenge is, I think.
Thank you so much. And you mentioned some things that are really like clean energy, renewables, wind, hydro, solar. So I'll ask Kwabena, what role do you think renewable energy can play in the energy transition in Africa, and how can it be integrated into existing systems?
Thank you so very much. Just to kind of go a little bit off of those facts, 600 million people without power, access to power, 590 in the sub-Saharan African region, as of 2021. That's a huge gap that definitely needs to be filled. And again, when you look at Africa, countries like Ethiopia is already at 100% clean energy using hydro. Kenya, Namibia, Zambia are above about 80%. So renewable energy is not something new. It's already playing a huge role within Africa. So that's something I kind of want to make sure we don't see it as something Africa is now adopting. In some countries, it's actually leading the charge. The question becomes, how do we get all the other countries, to kind of garner and transition to that? So to your question, a couple of things. I think solar is pretty big right now. After hydro, we can see solar mini grids, microgrids, penetrating certain places that other sources may not. One of the areas we work in is in the C&I market. How do industries power themselves with clean energy, consistent energy, and also the challenge of power outages? Look at South Africa and the challenge they're dealing with in terms of inconsistent power. The amount of productivity that goes out of the system, you can't even quantify. So we will look at bringing in renewable energy, solar energy into some of these C&I markets. But before we talk about renewable energy and all that, those are all cost factors, and I'll get to that. But one of the things we also look at is energy efficiency. So to get the best bang for your buck, you have to right-size systems before you apply those renewable energy sources. So we take a backstep approach and say, well, based on what we have, how can we make this efficient, or how can we make the system more efficient? So we do our regular efficiency measures, so we can get what exact amount of energy a facility needs or a city needs, if we can calculate that. Then figure out, well, what is the right amount of renewable energy that we need to apply? Part of this is costing, right? So you're not oversizing necessarily a system. More energy is always good. But if money is a factor, then you're not building systems that are larger to finance. And then it's kind of sort of moving to another sphere within this. In Africa, and I'll kind of draw a broad stroke, you see a lot of smaller renewable energy projects in the CNI market. Things probably 2 megawatts, and below, maybe 5 megawatts. Those areas are not touched. Most of the large organizations look at huge projects. There's an opportunity there for entrepreneurs, opportunity there for folks that want to get into that industry, even from a fund standpoint or whatever that is, to finance those type of projects. Now, those projects you can scale to and aggregate. So even if it's 2 megawatts and you have 100 of those, that becomes a huge number. So I think looking at those opportunities, in the transition in renewable energy is very important, and making it practical. So it's not just conversational all the time, but how can students from this conversation figure out and say, well, I can go back into Africa or my country, whatever that is, and get a project. There are certain, cost structures, certain areas like the CNI market where you can find opportunities to apply your knowledge and your skill set or get in the industry, either from a technical standpoint or from a funding standpoint. So that's kind of my high level thoughts. And then, finally, I think that Africa, outside of just talking about the solar piece and the end result, we look at the whole value chain. One of the things that has to happen is developing infrastructure and building these renewable sources on the continent. Solar panels, charging stations, all of those things, manufacturing those on the continent actually helps to scale and reduce that cost. So that thought process is what we should be in, not so much the end result of it, but how do we kind of boost this economy? How do we start this manufacturing piece? And then how do we play in the global market space, starting from the continent? So, that's kind of sort of my high level thoughts on that question. Thank you so much for it.
Yeah, thank you. And just to, I'd like to ask Andrew, you mentioned Power Africa, your work running that initiative back then. And I'd also like to ask you this question, the role of renewables. And if you could just, I don't know if a lot of people here know much about the Power Africa program, and just touch on what it entailed and, the success of that work in Africa.
So a couple of things. Power Africa was launched in 2013, and 2013 was a really exciting time. It was when a lot of people, both Republicans and Democrats and governments all over the world and the World Bank and everyone, was really excited about closing that gap of the 700 million people at the time in sub-Saharan Africa who didn't have access to electricity. And we took an all of the above technology approach. We didn't care whether it was natural gas. The goal was focusing on the people who don't have access to electricity. And the climate movement was moving forward. And then something happened when President Trump got elected, where he drew a tremendous amount of attention to the Paris Agreement and the climate agreement and pulled the US out of it. And so what you saw was, you almost saw a visceral reaction in 2020 when President Biden was elected, where everyone, people who maybe didn't really follow the climate movement, were very excited about the climate movement. And you saw all of these major commitments that were made that included telling African countries that if you want to get financing, we're only going to finance these types of technologies. And that really was unfair for a lot of reasons, which people now realize. But first of all, most people who are involved in the climate movement don't really understand how power systems work. They just don't. And I guess I would ask the people in this room, how many people in this room know what the energy mix for the Washington, D.C. area is, where we get most of our power? It's not from renewables. I can tell you that. Okay? Yeah, So maybe you can answer that. How many people in this room have solar panels on the roofs? Like, raise your hand if you have solar panels on your roofs, okay? Not the majority of the people. It's a handful of people. Yet we're asking countries in sub-Saharan Africa to develop their people who are much poorer than any of us to use only wind and solar and geothermal. And it's ridiculous, because at the one time, on the one hand, we saw what happened with the war in Ukraine, and suddenly the Ukrainians don't have access to electricity and they can't use the Russian gas. And so everyone's saying, how are we going to get the Ukrainians gas? But then people are saying, but we're not going to finance gas projects for people in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I'm not saying that gas is the solution. I disagree with my colleague that gas is what we're going to be using for generations and generations. But I do think, at least for the next generation, gas is going to play a critical role in helping people emerge from poverty. And there has to be that energy mix. But a lot of people in the climate movement, they think that you can just swap out 100 megawatts of solar for 100 megawatts of gas. And you can't do that. Gas provides power, and hydropower provides power 24 hours a day. It's always there for you. Whereas solar provides you power when the sun's shining, and the wind provides you power when the wind's blowing. But when the sun goes behind the clouds or it's night, you need some sort of storage. And what is that storage? The storage can be renewable. Okay? It can be hydropower, because what happens is you've got a big dam that's holding all that water, and when you need the power, you release some of that water and it spins turbines. So some of the critical things that we've learned over the last decade, we haven't been acting on. So Power Africa was tremendously successful in helping, I think, about 120, 140 power projects reach financial close, and a lot of them are moving forward. But then we saw this big dip during quarantine, not much move. There haven't been a lot of projects moving forward. But also what happened was we were focused so heavily on the power generation piece. How are we going to produce more power? But we didn't figure out and realize that you can produce all the power that you want. But if you can't get that power to people, you don't have that transmission infrastructure and that power distribution infrastructure, and if people aren't paying for the power, then you're just wasting money. And we see this in countries all over Africa. We see it in Nigeria, where I think there was a stat that Nigeria was generating 12,000 megawatts of electricity. It only had transmission infrastructure to accommodate 7,000 megawatts. It only had distribution infrastructure for 4,000 of those 12,000 megawatts, and they were only getting paid for 2,500 megawatts. That's not sustainable. And so we've learned a tremendous amount over the last decade, and we can make a huge difference. We can realize that we need to focus on that transmission and that distribution infrastructure. But even more importantly, we have to focus on interconnections between the countries, because Mozambique has a tremendous amount of gas, okay? And that gas can be baseload power. Zambia and Zimbabwe have massive hydropower resources. Namibia and Botswana have a limitless amount of sun. And you've got South Africa, which also has a lot of resources. And if you can get those countries to be interconnected, you actually can create a system where it's extremely efficient and extremely inexpensive, where you're getting that those hydropower plants are serving as a backup battery for the rest of the region as when the sun goes down and the wind stops blowing. And we know this is what we need to do. But instead, everyone's become distracted with saying, oh, we're going to start developing hydrogen power in Namibia. Namibia barely has any solar power, but no one has proven the commercial viability of hydrogen at scale. And these have become distractions of the climate movement. And we have to take a realistic approach if we're actually going to help the now 600 million people who don't have access to electricity actually have access to productive electricity.
So Ruth, I have a number of comments about that, but I realize that our sixth panelist has joined.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Yes, our sixth panelist, Vijaya Ramachandran. Okay, I'll just let her introduce herself quickly. Thank you for joining us. I think you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Sorry about the late arrival. I am Vijaya Ramachandran. I'm the Director for Energy and Development at the Breakthrough Institute in California. And I work also on energy poverty issues and looking at questions around what the energy mix should be for poor countries that have very little access to electricity.
Thank you. Okay, I'll just let Nekabari make his comments. Thank you.
I think there were a number of salient comments made, and the two that I think sort of resonate, as you stated, you didn't state it this way, but one of the things that we often talk about in the context of energy development, again, is that politics often gets in the way of rational economic behavior. And legislation can do a lot of things, but to your point, legislation, you can't legislate physics. Power is what it is. The utilities industry is based on laws of physics that don't change with the laws of Congress. And so this is one of those things that, to your point, around sort of the distraction, if you will, of some of the climate, sort of the climate change movement. I think it is well intentioned, but some of the realities I think are sometimes misplaced. And then the second piece that I'll say, and I can't remember which one of our I guess it might have been Alex that sort of mentioned it. I mentioned before that I am an electricity economist. I was a power trader for a number of years. And the one thing that you learn on the floor is, of course, is that electricity is a physical commodity, but then also electricity is a financial derivative. You can use electricity derivatives to sort of think about electricity risk management. And so one thing that a senior trader told me in my first year was, stop thinking about electricity as a commodity. Electricity is a phenomenon. Electricity is both everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So if you think about other commodities that you have, name one commodity that you have a 24/7 call option on that you can use by flicking a light switch. There are none. And the only way that you can achieve that sort of thing, I think to Morgan's point, is by scaling and by focusing on a true portfolio approach to development of energy. I think to your point about what the United States uses, for all the talk about DC being a clean energy hub, et cetera, DC is mostly powered by natural gas, mostly. Most of the East Coast of the United States, including New York, the center of some of, most of the climate change advocates, is powered by natural gas. And so I think it is a mistake to focus on one technology and sort of reduce the focus on some of the other technologies that I think in the African context, African countries are very well endowed with, right? You go talk to the Saudis. Yes, the Saudis are doing things with respect to renewables, but 70 to 80% of the Saudi Arabian economy that we all point to as the model for this is kind of how we want to live our lives, not politically, but at least economically, is powered by natural gas. And so I think it is a miss to sort of say that Africa should not be able to utilize some of the resources, particularly since a lot of those resources are there. We can take advantage of them. And to Alex's point, the point is that we can do so in a manner that is a lot less carbon intensive than it is now. Oil and gas companies, for all the bad about sort of what oil and gas companies are also carbon management firms. And I think to that point, oil and gas companies have a lot of the balance sheet strength, I think, to really invest in some of the technologies that we need to clean up that part of the value chain. And I think in the context of Africa, it's important for us to keep that in mind as we sort of focus on, again, sort of the focus with respect to the clean energy transition as well.
Yeah. Thank you. I think Morgan would like
Okay, I'm not trying to get applause, but listening to my colleagues brings up two things that kind of resonate with me. One is, the first thing is, as Andy said, generation is, we break the sector down, for those of us kind of there in the sector, into generation, where is it solar, is it hydro, is it gas, et cetera. The transmission, big long lines usually, historically, and it'll be less and less as we do more distributed generation. Those big long lines won't be as needed, but today they're needed. So generation, the transmission, the long power lines, and then the distribution. Who's connecting your house or your factory or your school or this building right here? Often three different players are doing that with three different sets of markets, and each country has their own regulations. So how we do it in the US is different than how they do it in Europe or in Brazil or in South Africa or in Indonesia. So the easiest thing to do is that distribution piece. Today in Africa, 25% of all energy that's generated is not distributed. It's lost. It's just lost in the system. In DC, I don't know what it is, probably 5%, less than that.
Much less than that.
Yeah, less than 5%. So that right there, that's 20, as Andy said, 20% of the power generated. Big power plants, whatever technology, you have to pay for that money, pay for that development. It's not ending up anywhere. If it's not ending up anywhere, the people aren't getting it, and utility, someone's paying for it, but not getting paid back. So there's a financial problem and a development problem. There's the human gap and the financial gap, just in the losses in the system. That, I think, is the lowest hanging fruit. How do we fix that is like a big priority. Then we have the whole, how do you generate more to meet that gap? So looking from my perspective, I see Africa in a unique context, that there's a lot of climate push globally. But we have to remember that Africa today, if you think about the global power sector emissions, Africa today accounts for 1% or less of the emissions from power generation globally, less than 1%. We're not going to solve the climate crisis by focusing on African power generation. It's the wrong problem. The problem is 50% is in Asia, 20% is in the US, in Europe, 1% in Africa. That's not the place to try to solve the world's climate change problem. I do think there's huge opportunities. to actually have cheaper power, more reliable, more sustainable, cheaper, and climate friendly. But telling African countries, in my view, they can't develop their resource because the fossil fuel is the problem is the wrong place. You're not solving anything. So how do you do it? The question is, how do you do it? And how do you help each country figure out the political economy of what resource do they have? Do they have hydropower? Do they have gas? Do they have solar? And then come up with a plan to help that country develop it. I think that's the way to do it. But it's hard work. And obviously, if it was easy, it would have been done by now. But this is, I think, where the minds have to be put on to like really crack that nut.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Thank you so much. And yes, I mean, that was his response is just going to lead us to the next question. Vijaya, so my question is, how can we promote equitable burden sharing in the energy transition between African countries and the West, especially given the differences in historical emissions and economic capabilities?
Thank you. I think that's a great question, and I think it follows directly from what the previous speaker just said. You know, there's huge inequities here in terms of power consumption. I think, you know, what the average Ethiopian or Kenyan consumes in terms of electricity in a year, the average American consumes in about 4 or 5 days, or maybe a week. There's just an enormous difference in levels of electricity consumption or levels of power consumption between sub-Saharan Africa and rich countries and even Asia. Many emerging markets in Asia consume much more power than do sub-Saharan Africans. So I think that's something that we shouldn't lose sight of. I think the other issue is that for many countries in Africa that are embarking on the process of industrialization, you cannot make cement and steel with solar and wind power. You cannot really build roads with solar and wind power, and you cannot make fertilizer very cheaply with wind and solar power. These are all things that are completely essential to modernization and to industrialization. And so in some sense, you know, when we're looking at this issue from an equity perspective, we need to give the poorest countries all of the available carbon budget. You know, anything we have left in terms of flexibility, in terms of use of fossils, particularly natural gas, should be reserved for the poorest countries. But what we're seeing is kind of an upside down approach. The rich countries are doing whatever they like. You know, Europe has been on a buying binge for natural gas to make up its deficits from the drop in Russian supplies. But at the same time, you know, European governments are insisting that Africans use only renewables. It is a very upside down situation. It's kind of highly unfair and highly inequitable. And, you know, given the fact that Africa sits on 600 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, it is incumbent upon all of us to try to help these countries end poverty and end energy poverty. But instead, we are seeing, you know, this, I think, a very inequitable approach to insisting that Africans use only renewables, or the multilateral banks insisting that they will only finance renewables. And, you know, my own view is this is driven by the richest shareholders of these institutions, because it is a very easy and painless way to satisfy their domestic environmental constituencies. You know, you can go to these international fora and say you're not funding fossils. Meanwhile, at home, you know, we're drilling and buying gas and doing whatever we need to keep power consumption as high as possible. So I really think that you know, we need to call out this hypocrisy, and we need to insist that Africans be able to develop the way they want to. There are half a dozen heads of state who have written op-eds in Western newspapers saying that they need the flexibility to develop gas reserves. And I think we need to call out the hypocrisy where we see it.
I just want to, I just want to clarify one thing for everyone. Nobody is telling African countries they can't develop their gas resources. No one's saying you can't do it. We're just saying that we provide financing, the powerful provide financing. We're not going to provide you the financing to do it. So Africans themselves can do it. I just want to make sure it's a technical clarification and you all can interpret it exactly the way that you interpreted it. We're not saying you can't do it. We're just saying we won't provide the financing. I mean, we will, like DFC, we actually will finance gas under certain circumstances. And particularly in Africa, if it's going to be something that's going to be beneficial to to poor people and increase access to electricity, we will do it. And a whole separate conversation is it's not just our fault, it's the African country's fault as well. And I can have a whole separate conversation with, I can offer some insights as to, for a long time I got frustrated with feeling like I was a failure as Power Africa, and someone said to me, at some point you need to stop blaming yourself. It's a lot of the countries and what they're doing themselves as well. So there's plenty of fault to go around with everyone that we're not getting this right.
Thank you.
Sorry. Sorry, I just wanted to jump in there with a comment. This is just on the back of what Andrew said. Great point. You're right, there's enough sort of fault to go around, but I think in the context of the question on equity, I perhaps don't, trying to sort of align that statement with what the world is asking for. Just because there's enough fault to go around, which is fair, you sort of still have to deal with the fact that the ask on the continent is one that could literally end the continent. So I think, when we speak about these things, we just need to be quite sanguine in how we, place these points. African governments are notorious for what they do, definitely, but ultimately, there is a responsibility across the entire ecosystem of the world to be somewhat fair in the request of, we've talked about 600 million people, we've talked about a 2 trillion bill for Africa to move into clean energy over the next 10, 15 years. And the entire Africa itself owes about $700 billion to multilateral organizations and are unable to meet those debt payments. So again, tongue in cheek, we're not asking you not to develop your gas, but hey, figure out how you do it, right? The continent will end effectively. And I think this is a reality we must all be able to face and then speak into. This is just a comment I want to make. Thank you.
Let me jump in here.
Clarify it if you want what I mean by
Oh,
that.
yeah,
If you don't
sure.
mind. I just want to just add a few things. And I think, both points are fair, but again, in the context of equity and being on ground, it's almost as though you're not quote unquote invited to a party, and you're asked to clean up part of the mess. And absolutely right. And that is not equitable at all in any sense. I don't think anybody should do it to the other. So at a certain point, it's not about who's responsible. It's about what's right, not just for Africa, but for the whole world in the grand context of it. And that's how we look at things. If we go and say everybody is to blame all the time, but at this juncture, Africa should not even be part of burden sharing necessarily. What Africa should focus on is sustainable development, considering the direct benefits to Africa, so it can catch up with the rest of the world. And that's where I think the ultimate value for the rest of the world will be. Then we can all move towards, fixing carbon emissions and all that. But I think there's a disparity there that has to be addressed, rightly. Is my thought on that.
Yeah, so is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I wrote a blog at the end of my time with Power Africa, and it's still available. It's called The 7 Deadly Challenges of Investing in African Infrastructure. And I spent about a year working on it with input from friends of mine all over the continent and others, because you don't want to insult anybody, but you also want to offer some reflections and what have we learned. But now I can kind of boil it down to 3 different issues that I see preventing development of large-scale infrastructure on the African continent. One has to do what you could call sort of the political economy or political will. When you want to see something get done, where I've seen it get done well, is actually where you have a very strong head of state who says to all of his or her ministers, you need to get aligned for us to get this to happen. Because you might have a company that makes an investment, Minister of Energy signs a deal, Minister of Finance says, no, I'm not going to do this. Or what's worse is governments come and they want to renegotiate deals that have already been negotiated, and they say, oh, that was a corrupt deal. That scares off private investment. And it's been happening all over. It's been happening in Ghana. It's been happening in Kenya. So this is a major problem. The second issue I would call the capacity issue, either governments or resource issue. So either governments don't have the people, just don't have the resources within the government to manage, implementation of new technologies. Maybe they haven't, they can't run a solar tender because they're pulled in 20 different directions. They just don't have enough staff. The other one is the capacity. They've never run a solar tender before. What people like the World Bank, IFC, USAID, what we can do is we can help. We should be focusing on that human resource issue to work on that. And then the third constraint is currency. Most of these infrastructure deals and power deals are 20-year deals, but the financing that we provide is dollar denominated. So your goal of trying to build a power project in Liberia is to make sure that poor people and small businesses have access to inexpensive electricity so that they can develop economically. Yet you're giving them a 20-year deal in US dollars, and you can be pretty much guaranteed that that local currency is going to depreciate against the dollar, by 100% over that time period. And what does that mean? You end up raising the rates. And so again, we as financing institutions, we need to realize that we need to take some of that hit. We need to provide that local currency financing. During the COP, one of the comments that was made by an African voice said, all of these announcements are just great. They're all in the wrong currency. But because that all the financial institutions are structured in such a way, most of them, that they need to earn a return, they continue to finance deals in US dollars. And that's a problem, and that needs to change.
Add something on that? Just to a few of the comments from the colleagues that are coming in virtually. So first is in terms of the different sources of capital, development banks, IFC, World Bank, DFC, et cetera. Just to be clear, so today there's, the owners of the World Bank, the owners of IFC are about 180 governments. So you can imagine it's like a United Nations when you go to a board meeting. Everyone has their own kind of view of the world. So job of management is to kind of make a case that we think is presentable, is justifiable. In this case of fossil fuels, it's super complicated today, but the kind of line in the sand is, at least for IFC, we can finance gas-fired plants in Africa, and we do. We financed one last year in Mozambique, working on 1 or 2 right now in West Africa. We can finance them. In other parts of the world, not so easy. So we're making the case that there is equity in how we choose where to do gas-fired plants. We will do it in some countries based on income level and not otherwise. That's kind of how we're trying to make the case that it makes sense to do it in Mozambique, but maybe not in Colombia or Brazil or something else. So that's kind of one point. The second point is on the whole question of the renewable agenda and the scalability. I think it's hugely scalable, and actually in many places, the renewables are actually more cost competitive than the fossil fuels. And that should be the agenda. How do you get both? The reliability, the access, and the cost down. I think that's the nirvana. How do you get there is the question.
Thank you. We don't have much time, so I'll just ask a few questions, and if you could please just keep it really short. Just to go, because we've talked about equity, burden sharing, I'd like to ask Alex, so how can we ensure that the energy transition in Africa does not result in new forms of dependency on external actors or technologies?
I think that's virtually impossible, but I'll take a stab at that. We have a real paradigm shift that's happening. And if we understand that the continent of Africa actually has everything it takes to transition, I'm talking the oil for today's utilization. And I think Vijaya, you spoke about all the derivatives of oil that effectively sit around us. I mean, in that room there, probably 60 to 70% of everything around you has a derivative of oil in it, So, so the question is, there is a value chain and a market for oil, and that has to be done responsibly in gas. And Africans need to continue to figure out how to accelerate that extraction and get that to a point where they can start to create the financing that would help them, I'm talking the governments now, to drive this, this transition. The second phase is the fact that I think James, I think it was Andrew actually, you spoke about the temporal nature of renewable energy. It comes and it goes. It's just what it is. A lot of the storage, the cobalt, the lithium, and all of that, we do have the precious metals deposits in Africa to huge degrees. We've seen in recent times some of the blue chip companies come to Nigeria to sign deals some were successful, some weren't so successful, to excavate these renewable precious metals and then take them out to process them. The Chinese are here doing the same thing. So the point I'm making is, end to end, we have what it takes to thrive in the transition. Where this starts to fall apart is, again, project financing, how you can create the PPAs, which are the purchasing agreements, that can support the development of these projects. And oftentimes, the areas in which you're trying to drive these projects in are desperately poor. So you do need government intervention. You do need some element of an enabling environment to allow capital flows come in and feel confident coming in. And of course, I think another colleague spoke about just how you stratify the risk. I mean, one of the important things the structure of risk apportionment for the finance philanthropy. You see, at the stages after that, you see some of the multilateral commercial banks coming when there's a real. We may have to look at that risk profiling a little bit different, where you have the multilateral work with the central banks to deal with that issue. Commercial bank, and if the model still stacks up, the commercial bank can come in. The philanthropists that continue to pour their money where their mouth is, and they continue to support a lot of these projects. Grant money comes in, and that supports. But I think that value chain of improving the risk apportioning on the financing journey is what really might help scale and implement some of these projects in areas where hitherto would have been impossible. I mean, my colleagues have covered all the other issues around, the transient nature and the breaks in the value chain. But I think this is where you can almost tie it all together and provide some lifeline in local currency for some of these projects.
Thank you. So just to end it, because I mean, this year's conference theme is "The Future is Africa and Harnessing Opportunities for a Prosperous Continent." So I would like us to end this conversation on an optimistic note. So I will just ask one question and probably get like 30 seconds to 40 seconds quick responses from our panelists. So my question is, so we have some people here from like the multilateral, like the IFC investment financing sector, like Andrew and Morgan, Nekabari, Alex from the private sector, and Kwabena, and then Vijaya from the development perspective. So just based on your perspective, what do you think are like the unrealized opportunities in energy transition? And just give us something, like the people listening here, like something to hold on to on how this isn't a challenge or an issue that there's almost no solution, because we talked about a lot of challenges, but just something we could look forward to in terms of energy transition. Vijaya, please.
I think we should be optimistic that Africa will be able to make use of its vast energy reserves. It's critical for Africa's development. We have to have a continuous supply of electricity. We have to have electricity on a large scale for factories and for homes and for schools. So I'm confident that, it's a tough road, but I think we will all come together and be able to develop the vast reserves that the continent has.
Thank you. Kwabena?
Sure, thank you. And I think one of the things we talked about but didn't talk about as much was small businesses in the private sector, and what their role could be in this. It's actually a great opportunity to get in this space. All of this will not work out if the private sector doesn't come and take over. So this is not a government initiative. We're talking about governments and what they do, and I think it's great. But the private sector, students in this room have a tremendous opportunity to get in that space and create change, put your ideas forth and implement. A lot of this is not about talk, but execution. When you execute, you get out there, you get it done. Three things, I want to leave everybody with. And the first thing was, it's not about talk. Develop and nurture relationships in this room and outside. That's very important. Number two, take risks and explore concepts in partnership. You might not solve this all by yourself. We're here trying to figure things out, but with you and another person, you might come up with ideas that are executable. And the last piece is just never give up. There are solutions. Africa is going to come out on top. I think we're all going to see parts of that, in our lifetime. And who plays that role, who's going to make that work, is the people in this room. So the responsibility really is on us to listen, but more so execute and talk less. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
We're going to see a massive amount of solar power being developed all across Southern Africa, Northern Africa. It's already commercially viable. And so once you figure out some of those transmission issues, the technology is there, the pricing is there, I think you're going to see an explosion of solar power development.
Thank you. Morgan.
I would say innovation. I think we've seen in the past 10, 15 years, costs drop dramatically on these kind of renewable technologies, and the future is going to be the same. Distributed models, rooftop solars, new kind of business models of commercial companies not needing these big power plants and long transmission lines. It's going to be cheaper, and I see it's the parallel with like the mobile phone technology. And Africa has a chance to kind of leapfrog the technology, to be the pioneer to make these things really work on the real world. So I think innovation, for me, is the optimism.
Thank you. Nekabari.
Sure. So, and keep me to 30 seconds here. I'm from River State, Nigeria, Port Harcourt, River State, Ogoni, if you know. And as such, I grew up going to a lot of markets in Port Harcourt. One of them is Diob, which if you know it, that's a pretty wild place. But there is something that shows that even in that wild context, it is part of Africa's culture to think through the development of markets. And I think that markets are one of the keys to the discussions about what is needed to unlock the full value chain of electricity deployment across the continent. If we can focus on the development of fully functioning markets, you'd be surprised to see the rate at which Africa will explode.
Thank you. Finally, Alex.
I think for us, it's very simple. Wando Clean Energy has put us sort of money where its mouth is, right? We're working on 5 different fronts: solar, gas and biofuels, sustainable transport, wind, geothermal, and waste to energy. Our biggest project has started already, kicked off with Lagos State, the 3rd most populous state in Africa. We're transitioning the Lagos State municipal transport system to electric buses. And why that sounds a bit crazy, what it does, it helps us create the arterial infrastructure to start to talk about real private sector utilization of that. And finally, on the solar side, we've embarked on building a 1 gig solar plant locally in Nigeria. So again, I mean, the guys in the room ready to finance. We're moving ahead without you guys, but it would be great to partner and scale these projects up considerably to start to do great things for Africa. I'll be honest with you guys, I'm truly bored about talking about this. A lot of conferences we go to, it's the same thing. And everyone in this room has heard this before. If we want to act for Africa, let's act. And if we want to do the right things, let's do them in a way that parity leads the conversation. But most importantly, we understand the purchasing power of Africa is very close to zero. All right, that will be it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, I don't have anything else to say because that's the call to action. We need to act. Partnerships, international, private, public collaboration partnership. It's really important. But thank you to our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause, please.
Venue sessions for the
Okay.
venue sessions. Sit now.
Yes.
This is venue session.
Thank you. So for the last sessions for today, we're going to have the startups and innovation here. No, we'll have the startup and innovations at Lorfink. That's the auditorium we started at. And then we're going to have the venture capital, private equity here, and impacts investments panel here. So the startups panel is going to be at Lorfink, and the VC panel would be here. Yeah, this room, like this room. Yes. Pardon? Yes.